Hello, welcome to my mini lecture on metacognition. Why do we need to know more about how things work than memorizing stuff? I always ask this question on the first day of class in a new quarter. And the reason I ask this question is that students always come into my classroom with a misconception that biology is a bunch of memorization. And I always reply, well, if you're just memorizing stuff, you're not really learning biology. And so why is biology, or any subject really, more than just about memorizing stuff? Well, things change, names change, concepts evolve. And so just to memorize things doesn't allow you to have that flexibility of your mind frame or your mindset about certain concepts. And almost more importantly, your smartphone carries more information than your brain ever can. You can look up anything so quickly nowadays that you don't really need necessarily to know all the little nitpicky facts. So I went to a lecture a couple years ago that was talking about the age of computers and artificial intelligence. And one of the things that really stuck with me was one of the presenters mentioned that in the future there will be two groups of people, those that tell computers what to do and those computers tell what to do. And what sets you apart from your smartphone is your ability to process that information, to evaluate that information, to analyze that information. And that kind of mindset, that kind of approach to knowledge is really what's going to be that difference between those two groups. Are you just going to use information? Or are you going to make information? Are you going to take that information and come upon a higher thinking associated with that information? And this is where we get to the concept of metacognition. What is metacognition? You've probably heard terms like that. You know, cognition is associated with thinking. Meta is usually something associated with higher, so meta-analysis, metamorphosis, these kinds of terms that you've probably heard before. But metacognition is really thinking about how you think, an awareness about your own personal cognitive process, or cognitive processes in general, if that happens to be what you study. And so one of the major innovations or major approaches to how students think was done through a very seminal paper where the concept of Bloom's taxonomy arose, which is this idea that just like we have taxonomy and how we sort different types of organisms, you can also sort different types of questions or thinking. And generally, for the most part, students spend almost all their time down here in understanding and remembering. This is not bad, but this is really sort of regurgitation, right? I give you a fact, you tell me it back. Maybe you can understand it and you can talk about it at a little higher level. You can explain the concepts, but that's really where it goes. What I'm interested in is moving you to higher Bloom's taxonomy, applying that data or that information in a new way. So applying it to a new situation, analyzing it. Can you distinguish between different parts of that information? Evaluating it. So do you really agree with it? Could you argue against it? Could you find support for it? And then creativity, which is really creating as sort of the highest level of Bloom's taxonomy, and usually where you tend not to get until you have enough of this information here to really move up to that part of taxonomy. So here's just another one of the same kinds of maps here, and you can see it's just giving you some ideas about how we have Bloom's taxonomy set up here. So you can see remembering is using these terms. Anything you have questions that say recognize or list or name. So you're going to see these kinds of terms used in questions associated with that type of taxonomy. This is once again just another way to visualize the same thing so that you have a sense of it. So you can see that really we're going to spend a lot more time up here and then hopefully touch into some of these areas here. So you should familiarize yourself with this because I'm going to give you example questions of each of these. So you're going to see on your quizzes which level of Bloom's taxonomy I'm testing you at. So imagine you're studying for an upcoming exam, and you've read through your notes or your textbook. What do you do next? So you should think about this. What do you do next? Do you go back and restudy it again? Do you try to recall the material? Maybe you take some notes. Maybe you draw. What do you do? This is a question I ask students quite a lot. So they did a big study in 2009. There's been multiple studies done on this. This is the only one I'm citing, but just be aware that this is one of many, many studies that have looked at this. And what you can see is that 57% of them reported that they would go reread their notes, 18 would practice some sort of recall, and 21% would do something else. Which of these groups of students plan to take advantage of the testing effect? Okay, so this is a concept called the testing effect. So this has been done, looked at, once again, multiple times, but this is just one example I'm going to give you right here. So these are 3 types of experimental groups. These are students that spend their whole time studying, and then they take the test. Okay, this is what we call cramming, right? Study, 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 take the test. Most of you probably do a lot of this. This would be the students read a text in 3 study periods and then recall it before they take that final test, or asked to give that information back to some sort of instructor or some sort of assessment. And then this is the last study group where students read the text once and then just spend all their time trying to recall. So recall, 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 recall. So this is this testing effect here, where we're constantly trying to remember. So they asked these students what they thought would give the best results, the best test result, and then they actually looked at it 1 week later, and students had a recall test. Which group students performed best after 1 week? So what do you think? Think about what you think about what you would imagine would be best. Well, here's what the data looks like. Get my picture off the screen here so you can see the data well. So here's the actual recall, and this is what they predicted, okay? So they predicted that the students at cram would get the best result, right? They'd have the highest judgment of learning, so they'd have the best score. And then it would go progressively down because they studied less, right? But this, based on a week later, 7 days later, this is what actually was the situation. The students that studied, and then finally took the exam had actually the poorest result, especially if they were trying to recall it some days later. If you look at the data, you'll see that they may have initially, if the test is given right away, a pretty good recall, maybe depending on the study, similar to what they would do for the SSSR. But over time, this is across all the studies shows that this technique of study, recall, 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 then test is going to yield the best possible answer. And this is what we call the fluency illusion. It's the belief that things are easy to remember now and they will be as well in the future. Okay, so they call this the fluency illusion. There's lots and lots and lots of data out there about this. And the concept is that we forget that we forget. And anyone who has kids knows, you think when you have a little baby, you're never going to forget these wonderful moments with your baby. And you do. You just forget it because that's the way our brains work. And so several aids contribute to the illusions of fluency. Okay, so do you go through things and highlight them? Fluency illusion. Making a study guide, another fluency illusion. Going through and taking careful notes as you read something. All of us do it. I did it when I was a student as well. Chapter outlines in the textbook, right? These are all things that give you the illusion that you have fluency in it, but they don't really give you the actual fluency that you need. There's a really great article, if you have a chance to read, called Why Flunking Exams is Actually a Good Thing. And this is the idea that the actual act of testing yourself is some of the most beneficial things that you can do to make yourself recall things. And so this has to do with, this is an extensive paper and article, and it's really interesting, and I think you would really enjoy it. So if you have a chance to read that. But it's the idea that you often learn most when you fail something. And I think this is a very hard lesson for students to learn because no one likes failing it. But remember, you always remember when you get something wrong, right? When you say something in class and you got it wrong, don't you always remember that moment and you remember what the right answer is? I almost guarantee you most of you have had that experience. We fail, but we fail forward. I love this saying because, boy, have I failed a lot in my life, right? There are things that I've messed up, right? So, but you fail forward. Testing might be the key to studying rather than the other way around. And I think that Francis Bacon said it very well when he said, if you read a piece of text through 20 times, you will not learn it by heart so easily as if you read it 10 times while attempting to recite it from time to time and consulting the text when your memory fails. I think there's not a lot of memorizing of poetry or anything like that anymore. In my father's time, certainly they did a lot of memorizing of poems, but I did some for my German classes and classes that I've taken where they were mostly language-based, where you're learning a language. And I think that there is something to be said for how you learn a new language, for example, or a poem, that you can't really learn it just by reading it over and over and over again. You've got to try to practice saying it, right? So these are the kinds of things that give you the illusion of fluency, but if you actually approach it in a way of testing yourself, then you'll get far farther. So here's another great article to read associated with how your memories betray you, and it has a lot to do with this idea of when you think you remember something, but you really don't. And so you can have a look at that as well. But I wanted to point out this idea of the iceberg illusion. I'm giving you lots of illusions today. But the iceberg illusion, which is this idea that people see success like this. They see this top of the iceberg. And I have people say, oh, that student, he or she, or they are just really, really smart. And I always want to point out to them that most of the time I see a whole lot of this. The students that are very successful, I see this because they come to my office hours, they get upset when they don't do well, they are always texting me or calling me or sending me an email associated with their different assignments. No one sees all that struggle. And so every time you say, oh, that person's just smart, you're dismissing all of that, what lies below the water, right? All of that hard work. And really, when I think about the people I know in my life who have been the most successful, they were not always the smartest. In fact, most often they were the hardest workers. Most often they were the most persistent. So it's something to think about. And so we're going to talk about big ideas. We're going to focus on big ideas like what is evolution and how things work. And so that's really what I want you to focus on. And these are from the Vision and Change concepts and competencies, which were a whole group of people got together and came up with these core concepts and competencies that we felt biology students should know. It's an NSF grant that many of us instructors were part of, and these are the concepts that are associated with that. And that's what I'm going to focus on this quarter. These big core concepts: evolution, structure and function, information flow, exchange and storage, pathways, transformation of energy and matter, and systems. And so that is the main goal, is these big types of concepts. And so we're going to try to do that by using some of these core competencies, which is apply the process of science, particularly apply the process of science, communicate and collaborate with other disciplines, and understand the relationship between science and society. These are important things that I want you to focus on this quarter. Here's some references associated with that if you want to have it looked over, some of the papers that I talked about. And so that's my overview of metacognition. Thanks for listening.